Judaism has always attributed Genesis through Deuteronomy to Moses. Genesis records history long before Moses' time, but it appears that the phrase, "these are the generations of," marks breaks between earlier patriarchal records that were handed down and Moses compiled into the historical background for Israel's rise as a nation in Canaan, or Genesis. Genesis is the book of beginnings, explaining the origin of heaven and earth, major life form groups, humans, sin, nations, and so on, as context for God's promise of a wounded Messiah, first noted in Genesis 3:15, coming to bless all through a genealogy that is recorded and promises made to the patriarchal fathers, Abraham, Isaac, Jacob, and Judah. These promises outline two major eras to come. First, a national focus on their fleshly descendants, Israel in Canaan, followed by an era during which blessings would be offered to all nations. Genesis opens with, "in the beginning," or "to begin with." Verse 1 is the overview. Verse 2 begins the details. Like a potter, God created matter and then formed and organized it. The word for God here is Elohim, and it is plural, us. And you'll see that reflected in Genesis 1:26, 3:22, and 11:7. The Godhead, Father, Word, and Son, and the Spirit. God is not an only one, but a united one. 3 points of harmonious consciousness. All were involved in creation. The Father spoke, the Word, Colossians 1:15 through 19, and the Spirit hovered over and brought order from chaos. God is transcendent. He exists before, beyond, and is separate from what He created. Genesis 1 describes cosmic creation. God created, bara, the universe out of nothing. In Latin, ex nihilo. God produced matter and normal natural processes. Now, normal natural processes do not rule out occasional interventions into the natural order, miracles, and special providence when it suits God's purposes. God's Spirit brings order out of chaos, first organizing physical matter into a functional natural universe and holding all things together. But later, the Spirit will, if welcomed and allowed, also organize the elements of a chaotic human life into a faithful and loving follower of God. And the same can occur when submissive individual believers with different gifts and personalities are willing to be blended into a peaceful, harmonious, and functional, local, called-out group of people. When churches experience a lot of arguing, division, and openly depart from Scripture, a different spirit, who is not holy, is running the show. Beginning in Genesis 1 verse 3, the creation of heaven, earth, and its life forms is presented in a 6-day format, each day ending with evening and morning, suggesting 24-hour days. Day 1, verses 3 through 5, God said, "Let there be light." This is probably an initial diffused light. Day 2, verses 6 through 8, the waters are divided with an expanse between them, called heaven, probably the atmosphere. Day 3, verses 9 through 13, earth began covered with water. Dry land or continents appeared later, then wild vegetation. Day 4, verses 14 to 19, time-marking heavenly bodies providing light to the earth, but they are not named, as many in the ancient world considered them to be deities. Moses, on the other hand, portrays them as simply elements of nature, a greater and a lesser light, for day and night, and he made the stars too. Day 5, verses 20 through 23, marine life and birds were created at the same time. Day 6, verses 24 to 31, land animals and insects. Then humans were made in His image to rule over and care for other life forms. At this point, Verse 31, God said the material and spiritual creation was very good. In verses 20 through 25, God created original major kinds of life at about the same time, and those would reproduce, vary, and adapt within those major groups. This is what known fossils have always looked like. In verses 26 through 28, man was created in male and female versions, both equally bearing God's image, and thus there are no grounds for gender arrogance. As God's image creatures, humans are capable of and responsible for stewardship over other life forms. That was our first divinely assigned task, and this is why we love our pets. We do veterinary science, animal rescue, and so on. On the other hand, one of our perpetual problems has been trying to rule over other humans, or politics, especially when leaders do not see themselves as God's servants, but are corrupted by power, money, fame, and their own foolish agendas. God is our first and best ruler. His boundaries and a sense of ultimate accountability to Him in our minds and hearts. When God is intentionally removed from the thinking of society and secularism dominates, look out, as things will get weird and go downhill. On the seventh day, God rested. While God was not worn out or tired, He did not need some hammock and iced tea time. He simply rested from or ceased His creation activity, but He did not end His providential oversight or ultimate authority over the creation. Normal natural processes began. God can still intervene when He chooses. Providence manipulates natural possibilities, while miracles bypass natural processes. But He normally lets nature operate. Just as a mechanic can build an automobile engine capable of running semi-autonomously as long as it has fuel, the mechanic can also intervene to make adjustments, change the speed, or turn it off. Signs are to signify something meaningful within God's larger purposes, not whimsical, meaningless displays of power. So try to discern the purpose or meaning of signs. Well, Genesis 1 and 2 do offer two creation accounts of human origins, but this is not evidence of clumsy human editing, for they are complementary, not contradictory. Genesis 1 is cosmic creation, the big picture of the universe, space, oceans, continents, vegetation, animal, and human life. The natural universe exists because of and within a larger, eternal, supernatural reality. Genesis 2 focuses on human origins and sets the stage with spiritual and social elements that underlie the story of sin and redemption that begins in Genesis 3. This is an old format, and we tell stories this way too. A big picture overview, and then a more focused account with selected details and more about the human story. The big picture might be, we took a big driving vacation through the western states. The more detailed picture, well, we started 2 weeks ago and had car trouble after leaving town. Then we spent 2 days in Colorado, 2 in Nevada, 3 in Arizona, 3 in California, 1 in Oregon and the kids got sick, then 2 in Idaho, 2 in Wyoming, then home again. And every time we tell it, we may add different details. Some imaginary speculation. The gap theory, probably to accommodate an old universe. Some imagine a huge gap between Genesis 1:1 and verse 2. Genesis 1:1 is an original creation that existed for a long time, then was left formless, void, and darkness as the wreckage from an earlier satanic rebellion and huge cosmic battle. So Genesis 1 verse 2 and following begins the account of a recreation or a remodel job. Ecclesiastes 7:29 is correct. Humans are very inventive. The gap theory demonstrates how people can imagine all sorts of fiction between verses rather than pay attention to what is revealed in the verses. At Genesis 1:31, everything's still very good. which suggests Satan had not yet rebelled, but did so by Genesis 3:1. Ezekiel 28:11-18 speaks of one behind and probably influencing the king of Tyre that was in Eden, was perfect before rebelling from pride. The Bible portrays Satan's rebellion as occurring during this creation, not an imagined earlier one. Evolution, or inherent natural progress, is more about atheism than nature. It's an optimistic, gradualistic progress nature myth that was first imagined by a few Greek atheists 2,500 years ago, who were disillusioned with the supernatural because of Homer's gods on Mount Olympus. This viewpoint was later revived by 18th and 19th century Europeans who were similarly disillusioned with what they saw in Catholic and Protestant Christendom. The evolutionary progress scenario is always rooted in imagined philosophical assumptions. Materialism is the philosophical belief that physical matter is all there is, while naturalism is the optimistic belief that natural processes inherently self-organize matter into higher levels of order. Atheists opposed Genesis and the Big Bang because they were anti-God and anti-beginning. They wanted eternal matter to inherently self-organize into ever better forms over time. However, later, with God removed, some big names in physics returned to imagining everything exploding out of nothing, ex nihilo. Maybe Genesis wasn't so far off, after all. Well, Genesis is a simple but sensible summary of origins. But Genesis is not a science textbook in the modern sense, although few textbooks need major updates and rewrites as often as do science books. It was not written to provide detailed information on astrophysics, geology, or biology for 21st century naturalists. However, where it does speak about nature, I would take that very seriously. Given time, Genesis 1 through 11 has actually tended to harmonize with accumulating evidence from nature and history rather well. Evolution and Darwinism were the philosophical products of European secularists who rejected Christendom and really wanted to imagine an origin story based on physical matter, gradual natural processes, and lots of time, with God eliminated. Since the mid-1800s, when it was embraced as secular dogma, accumulating evidence has shown it to be wrong in many areas, requiring frequent updating and major rewrites of the original stories. Unless dogmatically committed to matter plus natural processes plus time plus chance as the only possibility, do you really think galaxies, sun-orbiting planets, and DNA came about by an explosion and then nothing more than random, unguided chance? Who would believe the fancy cake on the counter is nothing more than self-existing matter amazingly organized rapidly by unguided natural processes? Only those with an irrational hatred of bakers. Do you really believe that given enough time, inanimate chemicals accidentally became alive and gradually organized themselves from single-celled life eventually into people? The fossils don't look like that happened. My dad was a college biology department head, and I learned Darwinism at home and in college. But I eventually realized that from what I had learned about actual biology, especially genetic mutation, DNA, and known fossils, I did not have enough faith to believe in Darwinism. Like cakes need a baker, this complex and amazing natural universe and life forms appear to have been intelligently designed. My dad was not an atheist. He believed there had to be an intelligence behind the natural order. And I later learned that he had serious doubts about the apes to humans part of the evolution story. For me, Genesis 1:1 through 2:4 provided a simple, sensible, and thought-provoking starting point. It ends with God taking a break, and so shall we.